George.
Thank you, Mr. Meek. We had requests for an update regarding COVID, so we'll provide that to you this afternoon. Start off with really good news, positive trend. That's the student isolations by day. You will see that as of the 8th of October, we were right below where we started school. We actually dipped below the start of school, and we're right under the start of school now. So that's a very positive note. New employees, same trend pattern, though looks like a little steeper decline down to one of our lowest levels of the year. Like we hit that same point about 2 or 3 times. In a minute, you'll see there's huge difference in employee numbers and student numbers. There's student quarantines by day. Again, fortunately, that number greatly decreasing from a peak of 1,144 to our current 197. Employee quarantines, we actually have fewer employees quarantining than we have employee isolations. You'll see that the number on 10/8 was 1. And again, that's largely attributed to the rate of vaccination among employees. 2021, total isolations and quarantines. Now, this goes back through September 30th. We have the data to date for us. What we don't have is the state. So that's the reason this is a look back to September the 30th. Our total as of that point was 3,968 student isolations. Again, as a reminder, that's students that have tested positive. 16,585 quarantines. Isolations represent a little over 5% of our students. Quarantines a little over 21%. That last bar simply shows us in comparison to the state. Generally speaking, whatever you talk about with us, we're 10% of the state. There are about 770 some odd thousand students in public schools in South Carolina, and we have 76,880 of them here. So our isolations reflect 8.46% of the total public school population, and our quarantines 8.05% of the total school population in the state. Employees, you'll see there are isolations, 580. Again, that number of 384, far fewer quarantines and isolations, generally most related to the level of vaccination. Percent of our employees, 4.59% of our employees have been isolated, and 3.04% have been quarantined. Our percent of employee cases as proportion to the state as a whole, we have about 14% of the state's isolations, but only 8% of the state's quarantines. Now, we also have to temper both of those isolation numbers with the fact that, generally speaking, Greenville County, the county itself, has been at the top of the state as far as number of isolations, both in raw number and proportionally throughout really going back to the start of school. All right, so our totals are down at the bottom. Isolations, 4,548. Quarantine, 1,669. Our percentage of isolations, 5.08%, and 18.9% quarantines. That's both students and employees together. And then you see that in comparison to public school cases. Now, again, that's how we rate. Going back to what I said earlier, 8.91%, we should reflect 10% if we were proportioned to the way we are proportioned in the population of the state. And same would be quarantine. That number you would estimate would be around 10%. Quarantine and subsequently isolated. In other words, an exposure becomes a positive case. total students through October the 8th, quarantined to isolate, 1,113. That represents 6.1% of the total quarantines that moved from quarantine to isolate. The next line, because we ask those questions of exposure, the ones we know, at least with almost 100% certainty, are related to an exposure from school, is 359, which is 1.97%. The actual percent exposure at school is likely going to be a number that falls between 1.97 and 6.1. We fully believe that everybody that's in that 1.97%, that's where they were exposed. But there is some number in between the 359 and the 1,113 that we can't say with absolute certainty they got it somewhere else. We just can't say it with absolute certainty. It's just not possible to do so. But we can say with almost absolute certainty that the 359 is at minimum correct. Employees, you see there, had 141 that moved from quarantine to isolate, which is about a third. But now remember what I showed you on a preceding slide, the number of employees we have in quarantine is lower than the number we have in isolation. So it's going to reflect a higher percentage. Universal masking considerations. Greenville County Schools will consider issuing a mandatory mask requirement on a school-by-school or facility basis after analyzing a number of factors. These factors will be considered in their totality with no single factor or group of factors triggering the decision. Now, this is our draft, so we'd certainly respond to any input that you might have following this meeting. Our internal data point, we'd look at a 10-day window with a total positive count of students isolating due to COVID is at or above 4.5% of the school's total population. That'd be the primary look. And you see the reason we selected 4.5. When you hit about 5, you're looking at closing the school, shutting it off, putting in virtual learning. The idea being if you get 4.5 and considering a number of other factors, that might avert closing a school and going to e-learning. We'd also look at the pediatric fill rate at local hospitals, if that's at or above 95%. If there's issues with hospital staffing levels, it's affecting their ability to serve students and staff. The total positive count of students isolating due to COVID is at or above the 4.5 for 5 days. Greater than 20% of a school's total population is absent due to COVID-19, either isolating or quarantining. Close contact in an increasing pattern. We'd also look at the overall student population of the school, the configuration of the facility and the physical size of the classrooms, the ability to keep students in isolated groups, the student population's eligibility and access to a COVID-19 vaccination as an option for their parents. Any concentration of positive cases to a particular grade, level, class, or organization, which would cause us to look within a school, not at the school as a whole. The following factors would lead Greenville County Schools to consider issuing a mandatory mask requirement district-wide. Once again, the factors would be considered in their totality with no single factor or group of factors triggering the decision. A variant of COVID-19 emerges that is significantly more contagious and harmful or less inhibited by existing vaccines, and/or the GCS internal spread rate tops 4,500 cases per 100,000 over a 2-week period, i.e. 4.5% in 100,000. And/or the trending pattern of COVID cases within GCS in the community is increasing. if we were to implement a temporary universal masking requirement. This is at a school or not. All employees and students at the affected schools will be required to wear a mask for at least 10 days, regardless of their vaccination status. Medical exemptions will be available for those with a medical diagnosis, the doctor's note. Students who are too young or intellectually disabled to continuously wear masks will be masked when possible and trained to wear masks for longer periods of time. Once the percentage of the student population testing positive for COVID-19 over the previous 10 days falls to below 4% and remains at or below that rate for at least 3 consecutive days, up to and including the 10th day of the mandate, the universal masking order will be lifted. That's where we stand. That is the draft of what we're looking at. Should cases rise to a level where we believe masking was indicated for health and safety purposes and to keep schools open as opposed to shifting to virtual or e-learning. I'd be glad to answer any questions that the group might have with me.
Thank you, Dr. Royster. Any questions? Any questions from board members? Mr. Lewis.
Dr. Royster, if we go back to the internal data point, external data point slide, so there's a number of factors that you've listed here, and it's kind of an and/or kind of scenario. But when you look at this slide and the next one, like what's the bullet that you're most likely to be paying attention to? Is it this 10-day window, or is it the kind of community pediatric fill rate? Or
the ones that would be the most, I think, critical trigger points would be that first one, this 4.5% of the school's total population having a positive count. Obviously, if we've filled up the hospital's ability to deal with critically ill, particularly pediatric patients, that would certainly weigh heavily in what we're considering. And the fact that it's at or above 4.5% for 5 consecutive days, not that it just hit a day and then maybe it leveled, dropping a little bit, but that it's at or above it for 4.5 consecutive days. And it's also important to look at the total, the things underneath that. For example, I'm just going to pick one particular school because it's a good example of the things that are down there about the facility size and rooms. We have a middle school. Northwest Middle School has the smallest classrooms, I believe, of any school in the district. It was designed with an open classroom concept. It was later, those rooms were partitioned off. They have very tight physical constraints up there. That's a school where we had one of the highest percentage of positive students if you look individually at schools. And I think one of the reasons that when we were at a high, it was so much higher there is because of the very close quarters and less ability to separate students out. So that would be a factor. If we looked at a school and the numbers really shot up, but they appeared isolated to a grade, then we might convert that grade to e-learning and not do anything with the other two if they seem relatively below an acceptable level. So there are a lot of those things that would come into play, but I think the biggest one is that hitting that 4.5 for 5 consecutive days, particularly if it appears to be inching up. Now, we would have hit that maybe once or twice in the peak that I showed you earlier. How many, Philip? 2 times we would have hit that in a school, correct? So that's how limited that would be in perspective with what we just went through. Now, what really is sort of, I think, also related to your question, I don't remember where it's listed in here, this one. That first bullet point under factors, that there's some variant that now emerges, like the Delta variant much more virulent among young people. Well, I don't know if there's a echo variant or whatever I don't know if they use the phonetic or the Greek alphabet, but what epsilon, would that be the next one in the Greek alphabet? So if there's this epsilon variant and it really targets, maybe it targets children under the age of 12, it might cause us to look differently at an elementary school than a middle or a high school. Or maybe that is more virulent at an older grade level. So but that one would be very concerning as there are variants that emerge of this virus. And one thing that has been, to a degree, a characteristic of this virus is there are these surges. I mean, you can go back and look back in time. There's a surge, and they're just like you can chart the little mini surges within this overall one. You can see obviously some surge points there. Fortunately, some of them are relatively short-lived. The other thing you have to remember is there's so many, every 5 days there's a 2-day surge, because they're not attributed back to the day of occurrence, they're attributed back to the day of report. Is that right, Easy? So almost every Monday there's a surge. Well, that's because that's Friday and Saturday. So it's part of Friday, late Friday, Saturday and Sunday. So there's always going to be, so some of those that really bump, you'd have to kind of drop them down a little bit, but the pattern is still true. The pattern would still look like that. So that's an important consideration.
I appreciate that. On the school level considerations, it says DHEC recommends considering a move to virtual learning if 5% of the student population is in isolation.
They recommend consideration at 5%, yes. I believe it's 5% on isolation. They use a variant 5 to 10%, and a total of 30% of isolation and quarantine. No, right, Janet? I don't want to misspeak. After a while, you look at so many of these.
You're correct.
But we have not had a school that's had 5% of their students isolating at the.
We've only had 2 occasions where we went above 4.5.
One went above 5. I think we had one that hit 5.2.
One day hit 5.2.
Okay. Thanks.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Anyone else? Ms. Leventis Wells.
So, Dr. Royster, you have Dr. Fauci that's come out and told all these kids to go trick-or-treating, that everything's fine. You have everybody going to all fall for Greenville, no mask. You watch football on TV, Clemson, Tennessee, everybody, no mask. You got private schools that wear masks and one grade level shut down. So I find it interesting. That's all I can say is I just find it interesting.
It is interesting, but we can't be responsible for other people's decisions. We have to be responsible for the safety and health of our employees and
I'm
students.
glad that we're keeping our own data and that we're keeping better data than DHEC. Because of the social distancing and so forth, 3 to 6 feet, they don't keep their records of that, do they?
They now keep them because school districts, which are the only entity in the state that does so, are sending them the data from each school district. I think they're still missing 1 or 2 districts that have not sent theirs.
Okay.
And as late as last Thursday, in a meeting between superintendents and DHEC, we again made the argument, not just me, but some other superintendents as well, that they go back and look at our actual move from quarantine to isolation and review their requirement. Because unlike what I think some people may believe as we hear comments from individuals, it's not a recommendation from DHEC. It is a requirement, and it's incumbent upon us to follow that. And I know you all know that. And Mr. Webb's provided the the legal documentation for that. So we, as late as last Thursday, encouraged them once again to go back and look at the data that we have,
Yes, sir.
and which is the only, to my knowledge, the only South Carolina specific data is that which is provided by school districts.
Right. And so they had no data when they moved from 3 feet to 6 feet to validate why they did that.
The explanation that we received, which goes back to why did they go from 6 feet to 3 feet, is the explanation that we received for that was that it was based on a study in Europe from last year. And I think it was also noted that in that study, I believe it was a country with universal masking, and they went from 6 to 3. When they moved back from 3 to 6, the explanation that we were given as late as last Thursday was because of this new variant and their concern of the spread of that variant.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Mosley.
Thank you. So, Dr. Royster, might jump around here for a second, but to piggyback off what you just said in the meeting, it sounds like you had a week ago where you asked DHEC to please look at the data that we provided along with other school districts in the state. What was DHEC's response to that?
They responded that they would look at it and consider it.
How many times have you heard that? I'm just asking because it seems like we've been giving them data now. It's October 12th. We've been giving them data for a while.
We first asked them that more than a month ago. We reiterated that request in person in a meeting with them in September, the first Thursday in September. Again, the first Thursday in October. They assured us in the meeting this past Thursday that they had in fact looked at it and would continue to do so and consider it. That's really all I can, I can't really speak for them, but I'm just relaying to you what was said to us.
So they've
And
given
we emphasize the concern that we have about, we have numbers to look at, and the amount of school time missed by individuals quarantining, where even with our numbers, when I first talked with them, our numbers were below 5%. They're at, let me see if I can get in real quick. Looking at the wrong direction. They're a little over 6% now. When we first started tracking this, we were below 5% total quarantine to isolation for students. Now again, this is older data because we picked it to try to align. This data is older. We picked it to try to align with DHEC's report, where you see down there our percentage of isolations and so forth. We were at 5% earlier. On the 8th, I do not have the state data for October the 8th because they run behind. And our report of quarantine to isolation, by the nature of the report, it's going to reflect like a week and a half, maybe a week and a half to 2 weeks backward look, because they went into quarantine and then at some point they tested positive and they get shifted over. So even our October the 8th is going to reflect probably a trend from September the 29th through October the, 3rd or 4th, something like that.
So they've given you no end game as to when they might feel like they have enough data to potentially change a recommendation.
That they did not speak in those specific terms.
Okay. Sorry, that startled me. When you speak with them, since we don't have any access to DHEC, when you speak with them, do they seem to have any understanding about the educational loss we're looking at? I mean, I'm looking at this going okay, let's just use those numbers. 94% of our students are staying well. We're basically keeping 94% of those that we send home out of school, out of a classroom. I mean, and not to point out the obvious, but we're in year 3 of this pandemic. I mean, educationally speaking. I'm just, as I have, I mean, I know I sound like a broken record, but it's the number one complaint I have from my community is children being at home. And I guess I'm just trying to understand
It's obviously a
why
concern
that's not
that-
understood at another level.
that we have as well. Our primary, almost exclusive communication, particularly in person, with Dr. Traxler, who's the medical chief. That's not the right title, but medical chief at DHEC. She seems very understanding of that concern. She seems receptive to it. She's not the one that makes that final decision. I believe, Janet, it is a group of people at the upper level leadership of DHEC that as a group make that decision. Is that a correct characterization?
Yeah, that's my understanding is Dr. Bell, Dr. Traxler, and the newest member, it's a male physician that joined the team. So it's the 3 of them that look at these recommendations
Who is it? I'm
and
sorry.
requirements.
Can you tell me?
Dr. Bell,
Dr. Bell, okay.
She's the chief
Yeah.
epidemiologist,
I
believe.
know her, I recognize her name.
Dr. Brandon Traxler.
Traxler, okay.
I think the third person you referred to is the newly appointed head of DHEC, Dr. Simmer.
Simmer, yeah, Edward Simmer, yep.
All right. So, hold on, I'm trying to read my chicken scratch here as you were talking. Jumping back around, so that recommendation that you said, or one of the bullet points that you said we would consider for universal masking was whether we were over 5%, I'm sorry, 4.5% for 5 consecutive days, is that correct? I'm trying to
Yeah,
find it.
either steady or an increasing number.
So it says, in the bullet point underneath, it says, DHEC recommends considering a move to virtual learning if 5% of the student population is in isolation or tested positive. Is that consistent with any other virus? Like if we had 5% of the school out for flu or 5% out for, I know norovirus is highly contagious, and I've known schools to close for that, for extensive cleaning and stuff.
Yeah, but generally speaking, with most things we've had to deal with in the past, we might just go in and do extensive cleaning.
Right.
Meningitis, there's a certain number of days, I do not recall how many, the more serious of the 2 meningitis. And they have a recommendation for flu, Janet, is it 25 or 30%, something like that?
They want you to look at 25%.
So for COVID, it's 5%, but for everything else, it's much greater than that.
Well, COVID, it's 5% sick, and I believe they want you to look at 30% total. Isn't that correct?
30% total absences related to COVID, so isolation and quarantine together. So it's a little bit different than flu because of the quarantine aspect here.
Okay, so like 30% complete absent, regardless of the reason. Okay. Given that, and I guess the reason I'm asking this question, and I know we can't control DHEC, but recently there was an article where the former FDA chief said that the 6 feet rule, for example, was just some arbitrary number that they made up. And so we're still clinging to some of these guidelines that I'm just really struggling why we continue to do this. The other thing is vaccination status. I know we've seen a lot in the news that I believe Pfizer has asked the FDA to approve for the 5 to 11-year-old age group.
That's my understanding as well.
If I'm I think I read an article the other day that it's going to go up before that board on October 26th, which leads me to believe that the earliest we could see vaccinations would be in the November timeframe, maybe. I mean,
That's
give or take.
consistent with the information that I both read and
Right.
actually what was shared with us from DHEC last Thursday. their belief is would be available first part of November.
Okay, so have you been given, if you were reading the tea leaves, or if you've been, or maybe you've been given more direct information, once that vaccine rolls out and is available to that group for whoever wants to get it, do you see anything changing? Because at this point, whether or not people have chosen to get the vaccine or not is on them. And we've already got many medical experts out there in the mainstream saying that COVID's not going away. It's going to be an endemic disease. In other words, we're going to deal with it just like we do with every other seasonal virus. So when you talk about these surges and all this stuff, are we, what do you see as we head in? I mean, or maybe what is the public health official saying to you about this? Because at some point, there just seems someone's got to make a decision on what the end game is here, and when the burden shifts back to the individual.
They have not spoken to that specifically. I think our better argument or case to be made with them right now has to do with the fact that we've got 93-94% of our students that are having to quarantine and miss a significant amount of school that are not going to become infected. And I think all the idea of distance is obviously the closer you are to a person who's infected, should they cough on you, sneeze on you, sweat come off of you and get on another person, the closer you are, the more likely that is to land on you, more likely it is to infect you. So at 6 feet, it would be less likely than at 3, just like 8 would be less likely than 6. We continue to push them to look at our numbers, either set a percentage that you got below. In fact, with several superintendents advocated for 5%. We're a little above that right now, but we've been at 5%. Several had advocated 5%. Some even suggested, well, to your point, look by where there's a vaccine available. So maybe it should be 6 feet with elementary children, and with generally speaking, middle school students, almost all of them eligible. Certainly all high school students are eligible. Maybe drop it at those levels. So far, none of those arguments have prevailed, but that seems a more likely closer in opportunity than the other. But that's just my take on it.
So I need things to make sense for me, and I guess that's the part that doesn't. So when they're telling you, okay, we're not going to change our mind right now, I guess this might be a rhetorical question. Why aren't we asking them to prove to us why this still needs to continue? In other words, they're saying it still needs to continue, but where's their data? Because they don't seem to have any. They have our data, but they don't seem to have their own. So maybe this is just me wearing my advocacy hat for a few minutes of why we're not asking for that.
I don't believe you should assume we didn't ask that.
Okay. Let me make sure. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Any other questions? Ms. Wells?
The way we're seeing data displayed for us this year is different than what we did last year, and I'm okay with that. As things change, we're trying to kind of get a beat on where we are in relative to the business we're trying to do, which is educating students. But I want to make sure I also understand. I want to benchmark against last year and where we were. So one thing I know is that because last year we had such a thoughtful process for establishing protocols, following protocols, constantly interacting with DHEC, push and pull. Hey, can we do this? This is what you want us to do. Can we do something different? And I believe because of that, we're on that line between not doing anything, making some people happy by not doing anything, and making sure we protect students. And I think the administration did an exceptional job. And I say that because, Dr. Royster, it was you leading that charge. The board was, we weren't doing that, that was you and your staff doing that. So I appreciate that. This year's so different, and we all thought this was going to be over, and it wasn't. And now we have vaccines, which we thought were supposed to be better, and it's just caused a lot of confusion. So when I'm looking at this data, we've got isolations and quarantine. Isolations meaning positive cases, right? So through September 30th, we have 3,968 students who have come down, who've contracted COVID in the last 6 weeks. Last year, what number of students did this virus affect? Does anybody, do you remember what that number was?
No, we've got that. We didn't put it in. We didn't put it in here for one reason. We're really comparing two unlike variants.
Right.
That was more. Obviously, this year it's more virulent in younger people than it was last year. In fact, we quit putting it in our daily numbers because it just became. It was something we weren't using, but we do have it. We can send that to you.
So I guess.
We never had a number that close. 1,700, Janet, does that sound right? Total?
For the year, all last year. So versus 3,968, so twice as many cases affecting children in 6 weeks. And what I remember is we said, last year, it doesn't affect students. It doesn't affect students. It shouldn't matter what we're doing. It shouldn't matter. It does matter what we're doing. Okay, so I'm going to give voice to that in the room because there are people out there that fall on a different side of this whole pandemic that I don't feel are adequately getting their say either. So I'm going to represent that. So that's a concern, those number of isolations, and hopefully all of those are recovering and they're not going to see long-term consequences, but that is a concern. Now, when you sent out your press release, you gave all the great things we're doing for protocol. So we got more air exchange, we got those multi-layer strategies, which is what DHEC says, what CDC says is so important that we have those in place. So I appreciate that that's what we're doing, and I want us to be able to keep students in school. If we look at what you're saying we're going to consider in terms of masking, if I remember correctly, we still quarantine, and the amount of time you spend at home and if you get sent home is still a function of if you're willing to share vaccination status or if you've worn a mask, right? So
currently, if both the person positive and the person closest to them is between 3 and 6 feet, if they both wear a mask, you don't have to quarantine. Currently, I think that perhaps might change to be perhaps might change, but only related to one being masked, I think.
well, and I certainly think sharing our data and getting them to adjust what they're doing is important, but I will say I believe the reason we have better results in terms of, as compared to the state is because our staff and administration have done such a great job of implementing with fidelity these measures to quarantine, as appropriate. And so if we can prove that there's a shift, that's fine, but I'm sure in the same vein, whatever that requirement is, you guys are going to follow it through with fidelity.
And I think to your point, part of the reason our quarantines are not maybe necessarily equal to what our share should be, is we have been very diligent, and that cuts both ways. It also keeps some people from being quarantined that don't have to be. So hopefully that maybe is a reason that we don't reflect 10% of the state.
So you give these considerations for universal masking, and this might be school by school or facility based. You've given some data points, but you said there are different things you're going to consider, so it's going to be still kind of looking at the whole body. If you made a decision about universal masking, are you going to make that decision? Are you going to bring that back to the board to have the board make the decision that yes, we want this masking to happen? Or does the board need to take a position now to say, Dr. Royster, under these circumstances, we support you and we want you to mask the students?
Our thinking right now, not asking you to do something today, would be to take a position on this part. We don't mind taking a position on dealing with an individual school, but we would, right now, that's our thinking, we would bring to you a finalized recommendation that you all would support. This is the structure under which we would put in place a universal masking requirement throughout the district.
So,
Of course, it reflects it's pretty much a mirror of what the individual school would be.
so you are going to bring that to the board?
That is our thinking right now, is that we would bring that to the board.
Okay, and I can appreciate that, because you've taken a lot of bullets for the last year and a half, and the staff has, and, on behalf of the board and with the board behind you, right? We're behind you, but, you had the shield out there. So I think it's appropriate for you to ask for that support. So the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to ask, on the data side, back to kind of what I was saying at the beginning, last year we talked a lot about the risk ratio. So it was safer last year for kids to be in school in terms of contracting COVID than it was for them to be out of school. And we could clearly see that in the numbers. And so we could say, okay, because of where we are, you're safer in school. We feel justified in continuing to have in-person instruction. Where are we this year with the risk ratio?
There have been varying points during the school year where it was not safer inside school than in the community. Now, I won't go so far as to say it's not safer for students, because the mitigating factor in that is this variant, it just seems, I don't know, that it attacks younger people at a higher rate might be a good way to look at it. So right now, if you look at the bigger community, you got a higher rate of vaccination among the regular population, even though our vaccination rate's not really high in the state or in the county, but it is now, I believe now one shot is around 60%, and people that have had 2 shots are approaching mid 50%. We got half our students aren't even eligible for a vaccine. That's basically elementary students. So you're looking at half of the 76,000. So right now, the community numbers are lesser than inside the system numbers for students.
Okay. So that's not good news, right? It's not.
But I think we can't separate out what of that is related to, and I think based on last year, you'd have to argue that a lot of it's related to this more attacks younger people.
But we can't, whereas last year we could have said we're keeping kids in school because we know how important it is for their mental health, and because we can't afford for them to lose educationally. But we also were able to say, hey, and they're really better off. They have less risk, right?
Absolutely.
Now that it appears that congregate settings appear to be the places where there's more rampant spread, then we can't really say, yeah, you're less likely or you're safer to be in school than you are to be out of school.
You know, guys, kind of going back to a point Ms. Levinas Wells made earlier, when you go out in the community, they're all out in the community. That probably wasn't maybe as true last year, but all these public events are still taking place, and the fact that we don't have them in school doesn't mean they're sitting at home. And they might have been more inclined to do that last year. But again, that's speculation.
Yeah, and I want to, I think we have to give voice to both sides of the concerns. We have varying concerns, and I think an important part of how we make our decisions has to be, yes, we have to look at data. Yes, we have to abide by what the public health agencies require that we do. And we have to be thoughtful about what we do. But we have to be balanced in giving consideration to all those voices and all those concerns, because the Delta variant is something that affects students more. It is something that some families are more concerned about this year than they were last year because of that knowledge. And so I don't want to kind of gloss over the fact that this is still an issue and it's still something that we have to figure out how to manage. Now, you know, to Ms. Mosley's point, it's going to be something that we're all going to have to figure out how to deal with, and hopefully with the medications and the treatments that they're coming out with, it's not going to be, you know, as dire circumstances, maybe a month from now or 6 months from now. But I just want to make sure I make it clear that I want us to be very careful and thoughtful about how we look at what we do in terms of protocols to protect public health and the safety and health of our students when it comes to this matter. So I appreciate the presentation. If I could get just the comparison numbers, just so I have it in my head, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
Ms. Levinas Wells.
Yes. This is going to be short, but I think Ms. Wells's numbers are skewed when you compare last year's to this year's, the numbers being so much lower than they are this year, because we had a lot of people on virtual and so forth. So we didn't have the numbers in the schools like we do this year. Also, we had social distancing, and we had every kind of glass protection, everything you could think of. So if you're going to compare apples to apples, that's not going to be apples to apples. That's going to be maybe grapes to apples. You've got how many students in the school right now?
We've got, let's see, we've got 76,882 total enrollment. We have, Jeff, 3,400 now in virtual. 3,500. We have, I didn't mention that earlier, we've continued to allow people to shift to virtual as there was an increased level of concern. I think we started the year at 3,200.
Actually, it's just under 3,000.
Under 3,000, and we're now at 3,500.
Yes, I'll double check the number for you.
So you can, and how many were in virtual last year?
23,000, depending on what time of year it was.
Right. And we had plexiglass, we had social distancing, and I mean, when you're looking at everything this year, I think what we need to do is, like you're doing, keeping track of everything. I'd also like to know how many people actually have the flu opposed to COVID. Because I'm going to tell you, I've had COVID and I've had the flu. The flu, 2 months ago, almost kicked me off the bandwagon. I mean, it was worse than the COVID, but I've had the vaccines. So I understand getting vaccinated. I understand social distancing. I understand those that can mask and those that can't. And I understand choice. And I understand that our district is about choice and protecting our students as well. So kudos to you, Bert, for using ESSER funds to add additional staff to make sure we've got the numbers to support everything and to help DHEC out make the right decisions. Thank you, Bert.
Well, thank you.
Ms. Bush, you got the last question.
Yes. Well, first, I want to thank you for the update. It seemed like we were forever there for a long time. It was all things COVID. We spent more time in COVID updates, which we should have been. And so this really, I almost feel like we're back to a roadmap where the board knows, the district knows, parents know. You can look at this and no matter what side, whether you fall on what side of an issue, you can know that for safety concerns, if your child's class or if you're, I think it's better than a one size fits all. Because if I have an elementary school in Slater, Marietta that has an outbreak of COVID, why should the kids at a high school, which is able to be vaccinated, the students have access to vaccines, why should those kids have to mask or shut down or go to virtual because there's an outbreak in Slater, Marietta? So I like the fact that we're closely watching all the numbers and making sure that we do have a plan for, and I think there's a lot of misinformation out there there's so much to go around on every side. One of my questions is about the what is actually, because I have had parents that I have talked to that said there is a massive outbreak at my child's school, or there are half of my child's class is, and I don't think there's a lot of clarity to some parents, which that puts you in a panic stage when you get that call about your child has to go into quarantine, and they don't really, some of us as board members aren't still really, we're just now getting a grasp on what does quarantine mean and what does isolate mean. That quarantine just means you may have been exposed and you were in the area. Isolation means you tested positive. So there was somewhere that I saw, and it said that at least 3 positive in one class is considered by DHEC is considered, and so that would be like for anything, for flu, for anything, not even just COVID, would be considered an outbreak. Are those numbers? Is that? DHEC
recommends 3 or more in a class. We modified that. Now, that's a recommendation from them, not a requirement. We modified that after discussing it with them, going back to some of the very same things we said up here. The size of the room.
Okay.
The number of students in that room. For example, you could have at a high school, Travelers Rest High School. Imagine the gym up there, because I know you're familiar with it. You could have 2 PE classes in there with 80 PE students in there. And if you applied that rule of 3, you'd have 80 people sitting at home for 3 positives. So we'd look at, all right, what was their proximity? How many people in there? We're probably not going to send 2 PE classes home because 3 kids tested positive. So we looked at percentages. We looked at 15%. We look at the size of the room. You could have a small class meeting in a large room where you can spread people out. The other thing that we've looked at, particularly in the schools where there's not as much moving around. So for example, in elementary school, if you had 3 or 4 maybe that were out in that room, and now you only got about 13 or 16 somewhere in there in the room, now you can spread them further out and just keep them apart. So we try to look at multiple factors to avoid closing a whole class. But we have closed entire classes. Those go through our process. Ultimately, Dr. Turner looks at that and he decides that we should close this class or not close it. Many cases that closing is triggered by the fact that the teachers, one of the ones not there. But there have been very few, if any, we've closed just on a flat 3.
No, we've never closed a class with
We
just
don't have
3.
any we've closed on a flat 3.
So, and that's great that we can assure parents that we are looking not at just, like I said, that one size fits all, that that we're going to do a mass district-wide assumption, that we are looking down to not only the classroom, but the size of the classroom, as you said, how many students are in there, and doing everything we can to make sure that those students are in as safe as an environment as we can provide for them. And one of the things I wanted to mention too, and thank you again for working on that partnership with the company that's doing the test sites. With Mako, yes. I saw a segment on the news where and I know that this is new. We've just been doing it for a couple, 2 or 3 weeks now. And
We're actually in our 5th week now.
Fifth week. Well, I guess because, I know that the news came across or released to us as board members as well as it did the general public. But until you have an opportunity to have to use that, and I would say fortunately this past weekend, I woke up with a scratchy throat and a fever. And I said, wait a minute, there's a test site, because I had been going previously when I had a COVID test to a private entity, and it would take 2 days to get in for the test, to get an appointment, and then 2 to 3 days for the results of the test. So Sunday morning when I woke up with that, I said, before I start the work week off and expose anybody to something, and I went at 1 o'clock, and there were like between 35 and 40 cars. I went up to the Northwest site, and I thought, oh, well, I guess this is where I'll spend the rest of my day. Well, one, I was impressed that they were open on Sunday, really. But I did arrive right when they were open, so there were a lot of cars there. I sat in line less than 15 minutes, and they just moved people through so fast. They were so professional. It went so quickly. They handed me 2 pieces of paper, and I mean, the cars were moving faster than I could just write my name and address and email, and that's all they asked for. And I went home, medicated. The next morning when I got up, I scanned the little barcode, and less than 24 hours, I had my results. I mean, so, and since then, I have talked to several parents that have said, I want to thank you for what y'all did with the testing, because with 2 or 3 children and with multiple times that you might need to go get tested, and the fact that it's free, and that they were able to carry and they were worried that if one child got quarantined, what about my other 2 children at home? So I've had several parents, but I just want to make sure that every opportunity and every way we can, because it concerned me that we said only 30% of the people in the quarantining, actually, if you get this test and it's negative, you can come back to school. It cuts several days off. So that's crucial. And just the sheer fact that if you think your child might have something like that, you want to be prepared for the fact if they do start to show symptoms. And so it was concerning that we only, and I would attribute that probably to the fact that people just don't know. People just have not, heard, or as in my case was, until you need it, it's out of your thoughts. But so I can say that it was wonderful, and I've heard from several parents that it was fantastic that they had the opportunity to be able to visit there and go through there, and that they the same way, they had quick results and were able to return their kids back to school quicker. So
Thank you. We certainly would encourage, I think we got a little uptick after that news story, the press conference that was held, but we still do not have near the number taking advantage of it that should. But I think we're up a little bit from the 30%, Philip.
Yes, sir, it is. We had a couple of days after that news conference, we actually were up in the 40% numbers of kids. So that couple of days now, not the overall average. And I think we're probably at 6,000 total tested so far.
So the more we can remind people of that, because to your point, that cuts 3 days off of their quarantine period.
yeah,
basically.
And I did have some parents that asked me, well, if you're doing it there, why don't you do it, why can't you offer it at the schools so the kids can take it at the school and get the results? And I said, well, I think you had mentioned before, the reason we don't want to do tests at schools is if a child is sick, we don't want them showing up at school. So just having it in the community and in the area where it can be a drive-through, because I can tell you, I felt much more comfortable going through and them doing the swab in a drive-through than I felt having to go into my doctor's office and sit in a waiting room where there might be other people that I was worried about getting exposed while seeing if I was. So I think it was a much, much safer environment that the test is performed in.
We probably wouldn't have enough people taking advantage of it to have it at every school. We don't want to bring people that are sick into a school, and then we get in issues with traffic, which would greatly restrict the hours we could operate. So that's why we use Fountain Inn. They're only ninth graders, so they're not using that student parking lot. MT Anderson, we've got a huge parking area there. And then certainly we are very appreciative that the county allowed us to use the Northside Recreation Facility where there's plenty of area there. So we're not interfering with other people's activities. And I think it's worked, as you noted, it's worked even when there's a line, it's worked pretty quickly. It was slow day one that we did it, just the first day. And that's, I think, to be expected. But the company that handles that has been very responsive. Mr. Davies done a great job of coordinating all that with them, but they've been very responsive, and they're certainly very responsive. Their turnaround window for test is 24 to 30 hours, but I think most of them come in between 20 and 24, has been our experience.
They've gotten quicker and quicker as the time's gone on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bush. I misspoke. We've got one more person who wants to ask a couple of questions. Ms. Doolin, you still there?
Yes, I'm here.
Go ahead. Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Thank you. I know y'all are getting ready to go, but Dr. Roser, I wanted to thank you for taking those data to advocate for change in their requirements, but I wondered if you had a feel of what the other superintendents were hoping they would hear from DHEC as well. Do you know what other districts are hoping of enforcing the regulations?
The majority of those present and the ones that I've talked with, now everybody wasn't there, there's 78 or 79 superintendents now. The majority of those present are supportive of the same thing that we're talking about and suggesting and recommending. And subsequently, I've talked individually with a number of those, and certainly they reiterated that support. And quite honestly, we're only a handful that didn't view that as something valuable to do.
But can you be specific about what changes you hope, or the other superintendents hope also would be a change in the quarantine regulations?
Specifically, that they would move from 6 feet back to the 3 feet they had earlier this summer.
Is that the only change that y'all are advocating for?
Yes.
And so far, you haven't even been able, have not even been willing to change the business of contact tracing.
To this point, no. They
Okay,
didn't say they wouldn't consider it. They said they would consider it, but to this point, they have not changed it.
So if they aren't willing to change from 6 feet to 3 feet, they're probably not gonna ever get to the point of being able to acknowledge that an illness-based quarantine might be the best for the community, rather than contact, possible contact.
I would hesitate to speculate on that.
Well, other areas have gone to just quarantining if you have symptoms rather than if you've been near someone. So I wondered if that was the end goal. So my other question is about antibodies tests. Is there any progress being made where we could accept a positive antibody test in lieu of a vaccine card to exempt from quarantine?
I've not really heard any discussion on that. Have you, Janet?
Haven't heard any updates regarding antibodies.
Is that something that y'all are comfortable talking to DHEC about and saying can we please accept antibodies tests?
I've had a few conversations with DHEC about that, and their answer to me is that they're still studying that and looking at that, and they do not have any guidelines updated for accepting antibody tests in lieu of quarantine.
Somewhat in line with your other question and something I alluded to a few minutes ago, DHEC just announced within the last 30 minutes that they're going to change the definition or the requirement for quarantine to not changing the distance totally, but prior to an hour ago, if both the infected person and the person exposed were wearing a mask, the 3-foot rule applied, not the 6-foot. Within the past hour, they have changed that to allow if only the exposed person, not the infected one, the exposed person, his mask, it drops from 6 feet to 3 feet. So they eliminated the need for both to be masked, for moving it from 6 feet to 3 feet, to the individual that you would have to consider for quarantine. If they are masked, it drops it from 6 feet to 3 feet.
How do we keep up with all?
Well, unfortunately, it requires a significant amount of time for people that all have numerous other responsibilities.
You're right.
Well, and this whole time, haven't they kept saying that wearing a mask protects other people? And so shouldn't it be the sick person would have a mask on and not everyone else? And isn't that what they've been saying? The mask protects everyone else?
I assume that's a rhetorical question because I wouldn't attempt to answer how they process their information.
Well, can we just get to a point where can we hire our own health experts to go over instead of listening to DHEC?
Well, as long as the law remains the law, we need to follow the law, whether we might agree with it or not.
We have to follow the law.
Wouldn't that be your advice, Mr. Webb?
Yes.
That is correct.
Yes.
I didn't want you to feel left out.
Well, thank you.
Well, but for the record, Dr. Bell, Dr. Traxler, and Dr. Summer were not elected and are not lawmakers. I know that they have the authority with the exclusion list. We don't have to get into that, but to keep changing these, I know everyone is frustrated, but Dr. Worcester, I really appreciate you taking that data to DHEC to try and get things changed. Thank you.
Thank you.